Hey everyone, this is Scott again. Thought I would do another hopefully quick Ember tutorial. Specifically, this time I wanted to focus on Ember components. So if you've been working in Ember at all, most likely you've written components already. If you're just starting out in Ember, you're going to write a lot of components. They do quite a bit for us, and it's a really great way for you to break up parts of your application or just parts of your JavaScript. So in a nutshell, what is an Ember component? Well, if you go to the official Ember website, it says it's an Ember component is a view that is completely isolated. And that means it's not aware of the rest of your application. So Ember components are only aware of the information that we pass to them, which is great. They're not going to be aware of our controller, they're not going to be aware of our router or our store. They're only going to handle what we give them. So we can write really isolated pieces of our application and know that, hey, no matter where I put this, it's always going to run consistently because I'm always going to pass the right things to it, and it doesn't care what else is happening in my application. So I thought I would go through a quick example of mocking some of these up. So per usual, just to show you what version of Ember I'm on, this is Ember 2.61. That should be the most recent version of Ember. So the normal caveat, if you're watching this video down the line and a new version of Ember has come out, know that some of this stuff might have changed. So just to show you what application I'm running in, it's the Super Rentals repository. This is actually the application that you build if you follow the Ember guides on the actual Ember website. And you can actually pull this down right here. So github.com/Ember.js/Super Rentals. Just go ahead and clone this if you have Git. Otherwise, you can download the zip file. You can kind of know what I'm working with. And I'm not really going to work specifically in the data that it has here. I just kind of like the default styling, and it's also just a good example of a quick application that you can build. So I checked out a new branch here called component tutorial. So let's just start by just generating a fresh route. So Ember generate route, and we'll call it tutorial. Great. So now let's run this application. Cool, so it's being served on localhost 4200. Great, so here's the application running. And in this case, we want to browse to this new route that we created /tutorial. So great, we got a clean slate in our Super Rentals application. So again, I'm not going to work with the actual rentals model that we have. Let's just go ahead and mock up a couple things for ourselves. So I also want a controller there. So Ember generate controller tutorial, just so that I can just place some data in, and we don't have to deal with like hitting the store because that's kind of out of the scope of this tutorial. So let me jump into the code now. So we've gone through, we've generated our new route. It's this tutorial route. We won't need to really return any model here. Again, kind of out of the scope of what we're doing. If you have questions on that, though, you can check out some of my other videos where I've covered that. But specifically here in the controller, I want to set up some users. So I'm just going to call it users, and I'm going to just create an array of users. We'll have an ID of 1, and we'll say name is Bob, and I don't know, maybe an occupation. Bob can be a plumber. So we'll copy this to ID 2. Then we'll have Lisa. She, of course, is our lawyer. Whoops. ID 3. And we'll have Cheryl, who is a doctor. Cool. So I just got this quick little, oops, don't want a semicolon there. Quick little thing of users. So again, things on our controller, make it so that we can access those things on our template. And that's what controllers are for. Controls what data is accessible in our view. So if we actually go here now, let's actually just iterate over this list real quick. For each users as user, and we'll end our each, and then we'll just list out some information here. Maybe each one we want the user.name, and we'll do like an h3 user.occupation. Template compiler failed. Ha, that's because I didn't match my closing brackets. Great. So Bob's a plumber, Lisa's a lawyer, Cheryl is a doctor. Cool. So we got a quick little mock model here. So let's start actually just by creating a component. And ultimately, I want to create a component that allows us to filter out that list. So let's go Ember generate component, user filter. So one of the important things is that components have to have a dash in their name. So if I said user filter, Ember's going to yell at me. You must include a hyphen in component names. And the reason for that is it just helps the Ember resolver kind of fetch things faster. So if it sees a hyphen, then it knows to check components first. If it doesn't see a hyphen, then it knows not to look in the components directory. Other than that, as far as I know, that's all it really does. It's more of an optimization thing. So let's just generate user filter. Awesome. So if you are using normal structure, you're going to have a components directory that adds the user filter JS file, as well as in the templates, there's going to be a components subdirectory that has the template for user filter. If you're using pod structure, and if you have questions on what pod structure is, you should probably just go watch one of my other videos. I really like pod structure. It just puts everything in the same directory. So we would have a components directory, then a user filter directory, and then we would have a template file and a component file. I like that because it just kind of keeps everything in one place. It's really not a big deal though. It all does the same thing. So let's just go ahead here and maybe put something in. So we'll have a header one. Hi, this is a component. This is some additional text. Whoops. And let me increase my font size here so this is easier to read. So we have a component. It has a template file. So how do we get this onto our actual page? Well, let's go back to this tutorial here. So if we want to render this component, we would call it just user filter. We come back here, look at that, there's our component. So you might be thinking, like, does it just take the template and just paste it in here? Because that's certainly what I wondered the first time I saw this. And what it actually does by default is it puts it in a div. So all components are going to be divs by default. They're really unstyled, so you can see there's no margin or padding, so you're usually not going to break any styling by just throwing those around. But this is an important thing to remember, because if you are writing really specific CSS where you maybe grab the first div of a child or something like that, having components in there might actually mess that up. So along those lines, if there are things that you don't want to be divs, you can actually specify a tag name. So if we go into the actual component file, so the JavaScript file where we extend our component class, we can actually specify tag name to be whatever element we want. So for instance, let's say we want this to be a section. So let's save that, and we come back here. And when it refreshes, we'll inspect this again, and we see now it's a section instead of a div. So again, by default, it's always going to be a div, but you can specify any tag name that you want. Similarly, so here I specified that in the actual component, but much like any other property, I could have passed that in too. So if I passed it into the component when I called it from my template, it would have the same exact result. And as a rule of thumb, in general, if you want a component to always be a type of element, then that's when you would do it here, because I want this to be applied to all of my components. But if there's maybe like one instance where you're like, oh, you know what, I actually want this to be an article instead, this one will always take precedence. So let's inspect that one more time. So here, even though I specified tag name, section in the JavaScript file where I'm extending the component class, the inline call gets priority. So again, you know, I want all of these to be sections except for this one instance where I want it to be an article. That's when you would kind of do something like this. So similarly to that, there's a few other things that you might want to add consistently. One is class names. And this is actually an array, so even if you only have one class, you still have to specify it as an array. And maybe we'll give it a class of tutorial. So again, let's come right back here to our application that's running and inspect this. And you can see we now have an additional class of tutorial. We'll always have that class of Ember view. Ember's doing that for us. And sorry, let me increase the font size here. So Ember tutorial, great. If I wanted to specify multiple, comma separated is an array. Tutorial test, cool. Really simple. And then similarly, we can actually add additional ones. Additional class. Wait for it to re-render. So now we have tutorial, test, and additional class. So along the same lines of tag names, the rule of thumb is if there are classes that you want to be applied to all your components, do that in the JavaScript file. But know that you can optionally add other classes inline if you want to. Those do not overwrite the ones that you specify in the JavaScript file. Those will always be there. And similarly, you can set IDs just like any other really HTML. Just like that, just like it's an actual div. Cool. So that's kind of the basics to components. One of the other things that components do is if you look at the actual file here, you'll notice that we have a yield field, and this works very much like outlets in routes. An outlet is where the subroute would be generated. So maybe here I have like a footer with some additional text. Oops, additional text. So if I switch back here, we have the additional text here. So here is everything, and my yield is right here. So if I want to render something in this component, that's when you would do it as what's called a block component. And if you were wondering, that's exactly actually what's going on in this each loop. And I'll show you an example of how we can actually use as in our filters, or excuse me, in our component as well. So here, now maybe I have some h5 tag that just says hola, and that's going to be rendered right in between my component. Really, really simple. And maybe I only want this additional text to be shown if I'm rendering something in the yield. That's when we can access the has block property. So I think that's how we do it. So additional text is shown here, but if we come here and we just, let's maybe do another one of these components down here, but we're not rendering it as a block, you'll see the additional text is not there. So if you are specifying it with the $, that's you saying this is a block component, so I'm going to render something in its yield field. If you're not, then it is not a block. So if there is kind of things you want to show or not show when they are blocks, that's when you can do something like that. Really, really simple. If has block, render this stuff. Cool. So some of the other things that you can do in terms of setting items. So we've covered tag names and class names, which are a great way to customize these components for like consistent behavior. And that's one of those things that I didn't really feel was super obvious when I first started with components. So one of the other things that I want to cover that I think is really, really important is the Ember component lifecycle. So if you just Google Ember component lifecycle, you'll come to this really handy page. And what these are a bunch of functions that are called every single time that you create a component or you update a component. So there's init, that's the very first thing that's called. Did receive attrs is when it receives attributes, so the information that we pass to it. Will render is the call, is essentially specifying that it's going to render. Did insert element, it's actually inserted onto the page, and did render, it's rendered the content within the component in the browser. And these are hooks that you actually might want to hook into. So the way you do that is right here in the component.js file. So we can specify init. We can specify did receive attrs. We can specify did insert element. And what am I missing? Oops, will render. And did render, so. And just to show how, kind of the order here. So this is init. Receive attrs. Will render. Did insert element. Did render. Cool. So let's save that. Our application updates, but we have an error, which is you must call this .super arguments. So what does that mean? If you've watched my one video on Ember-Data, where I kind of explain this, what this is really doing is saying call the default function for init or did receive attrs or will render on the component class, keep doing what it's going to normally do. So Ember components are, our classes, we're extending the base class here, and that's what gives us access to these functions that already exist. So we want to make sure that these functions keep doing what they would normally do. We don't want to fully overwrite them, we want to add on to them. So that's what this .super arguments does. So super, in this case, is the base class version of whatever function we're currently in, and arguments would happen to be any arguments that we happen to pass to these functions. So if we do this, great. Now this renders, we'll see this is init, receive attrs will render, and then you'll see we get another call of this is init, and that's because it's happening twice, because we're using this component twice on our page. We're calling these functions twice, and that's, again, gets back to these things that components are stateless. They're not like controllers. Controllers are singletons. There's only one instance of a controller for my whole application. So the controller that I'm using here with these users, if I go to a subroute and I edit this user list and I come back here, this user list will have been edited because there's only one instance of that controller. Components aren't like that. That's why all these things get called twice. Components aren't aware of one another. The components aren't aware of the parent application. They're only aware of whatever they're doing. So just to simplify this, let's just get rid of the second one so we can kind of follow what's happening here. So just know that if you want to do certain functions, if you want to automatically call a function when a component is rendered or inserted, that's when you would hook into these functions here. So, I want to maybe do some jQuery stuff. You can't do jQuery stuff on a init because it hasn't rendered yet. So you would do that in the did render or the did insert element, because we actually might need to hook into a DOM element that's on the page. We obviously need to wait for it to be on the page. That's exactly what these functions are for. You can also use them to kind of set some default attributes, or maybe play around with the data that you pass in. So maybe I pass in that users list and I want to go and capitalize the occupations. You would do that in the did receive attrs. So I've received the attributes that I'm passing in to this component. So here, here's our component, and I want to say users equals users. And now here I can console log, or let me do it on the same line here. Users is not defined, and that's because this.users, I have to get it. Oops. Cool. So here's my array with a bunch of objects, and these are Ember objects now. So one of the other things some people point out is you could also do this dot get users, and that's going to do the same exact thing for us. You'll notice I'm always going to do it this way, because they're going to give us the same exact thing. The difference between Ember.get and this.get is Ember.get will work on promises that haven't resolved yet. This.get will not. So it's one of those things that Ember.get's going to work 100% of the time for me, and this.get's going to work like 90% of the time. So just for consistency, I do it this way, because this.get, from a performance standpoint, isn't really doing anything extra for me. But just keep that in mind when you're reading other people's work. This.get, I believe, is like the jQuery get, and that's going to work just fine on normal Ember objects like what we're passing around here, or excuse me, normal JavaScript objects. But Ember.get, will work if you're hitting an API and you're waiting for a promise to resolve. It will properly do that, whereas this.get will fail. So just something to keep in mind. Cool. So let's go over one other thing that we can do. Let's keep the did receive attrs. So I want to say let users equals Ember.get this users. Let's get rid of this console. And one of the things I always do, and you don't have to do this, in fact it's done by default for you, but anything that my component depends on, so I'm going to write a component about users, I go ahead and I just specify it here. This is more of a styling thing. It just kind of makes it obvious to other developers that, hey, this is a property that I'm expecting. It gets overwritten right here, or excuse me, it gets overwritten when we actually pass it into the component, because again, everything here takes precedence over everything that we specify here, just like with the tag names. But again, it's a nice way to say, this is required for this component to work. Again, just kind of a nice way to flag that to any other developers that might be looking at this code. So similarly, I want to have a first user, and that's going to be set to null. And I'm going to set the first user in this list to be that. So we can say, let first user equals Ember.get. We'll say this users.first object. Actually don't need this line. And then we'll do Ember.set this first user to be our local variable first user. So this refers to our component class here. So get this first user specifies this one, and I'm setting it to the value of first user here. And one of the other things I've gone over in some of my other videos is I really like destructuring stuff. So now I can actually get rid of this stuff, makes it a little cleaner. So this is Babel.js's shorthand way of saying like var get equals Ember.get, right? So now I can access it as get instead of Ember.get. So let's make sure I don't have any errors, and I don't. Cool. So now we have our first user. And I actually want to make this a form. And in the actual template for the user filter, let's go ahead and delete all of this. Let's make this not a block component anymore. So now we're going to create some inputs, and the value here is first user.name, and we'll add a label here, name, and we'll add another label here, occupation, right? If I could spell it correctly. Input type, oops, text, and value equals first user.occupation. So let's just go make sure this works. Cool, so here's my little tiny form, and it's populated with the first user, Bob, who's the plumber. So just to review how we did that, I passed in users from my controller. So again, controllers control what data is accessible on our templates. So here's this users array with a bunch of objects. I pass that to my component. That is an attr, an attribute. So therefore, on the did receive attrs hook, I can specify a first user. So look at that array and give me the first object in it. First object's a great thing to use, especially if you're dealing with tons of data, and I only want the first one back. And then we set this first user to be, the first user there. So this is an instance of when did receive attrs is super handy. I got an array, I only want an object back. Obviously, I need to wait for those attributes to be accessible. And that's when you kind of hook into this did receive attrs. I know it's going to get called every single time that my component is rendered. So really, really handy. And if we go and inspect this, again, we see that it's a form. So we specify class names in our component. We can actually specify lots of other things based on what type of thing it is. So forms typically have buttons, right? Type submit, we'll call it submit. So here's my little form, I submit. What is it doing? It's just going there because it has no action specified. So if I want to set an action on that, I can do that through attribute binding. So let's hop back into the application here. So if we go back to our component files, we can specify attribute bindings. And just like class names, these are arrays. So if I want to set a default action, that's what forms do. The action is where they submit the data to. I would have to specify it here in the attribute bindings. And then I can specify the action here. So let's say I'm going to google.com. If I go here, look at that, action goes to google.com. If I click submit, it sends me to google.com. So really, really simple. Any sort of attribute that you want rendered on the components tag. So again, this component is going to be a form. I want to set some attributes. In this case, an action. You can do that. And you can specify as many attributes as you want here. One of the other really cool things is that we can also have access to different jQuery events. We are inputting. We are inputting because I took 3 keystrokes there. So that's really cool because there's inputs on my component. Anytime I make a change to a component, I can just get into that input hook. Similarly with submit. And submit is an event. And I want to do event.prevent default. That's going to keep it from actually submitting. See, now I can click it a bunch of times. So because this is a form and because forms have submit actions, I can hook into that in my component. So really, really handy. We can isolate all of our form logic to our form component. In fact, if we wanted like certain rules to be there for all of our forms, we wouldn't even need a template. We could create this component file here with all this kind of form logic, and then we can extend this component in other components. So if later I want to create, if I want a form for users and I want a form for rental properties or books, but I want certain logic for submit and input to be enforced, create a parent component, and then you can actually import that component and extend it here, add some additional logic to it. Just something to keep in mind. That's basic, just JavaScript class extension, but it's really, really handy. Cool. So we've covered how we can set bindings and stuff. Now let's go over something really cool, which is something that's pretty much happening here. We want to render a filter list, which is why I called it user filter. So let's go through and just delete all this, save that, and again, we'll delete all this too. Just kind of start from scratch here. So in this case, I am going to do a block level component. So we're going to yield. And here I'm going to do an input. Type is text again. And I'm going to put a placeholder here. Oops. Enter first name. Enter first name. Really, really simple. And because we want them to enter the first name, the value, oops, is going to be first name. So again, because this component is depending on having something called first name, I'm going to specify it here. But again, this really isn't necessary because by default it's going to set first name to null. But again, just a way to show like, hey, this component only works if we have a first name, so you should make sure you're doing something with it. So I'm still going to have my users, which are null, but I'm also going to have a filtered list of users. And that is also going to be set to null. So let's come back here. Here's my filtered list, and let's just comment this out for right now. And users equals users. So the filtered list, because I don't want to manipulate the users directly, right? Because I don't want to delete them, but I do want to filter out the list of users that I have. So by default, let's assume that the list is unfiltered. So by default, I should show all the users. So to do that, when we receive attrs, let's do super dot arguments again. I should set filtered users by default to be equal to users. So they are separate objects, but when we first start, I want the filtered list to include all of the users. So let users equals get this users, right? Then I want to set this filtered users to be users. So if we go back to the application, we see we don't have anything here yet because I'm not rendering anything in this component. So if I go to the user filter though, what do I want to show to the actual user? And this is something that's really cool. We can specify the context of our yield. So I'm going to yield filtered users. So this is actually what this each loop is doing here. So if we do something similar, we could say we pass users as let's say people. Oop, user filter. And then we change this to people. We can actually throw this in here. We indent this. Look at that. We have our whole list here. But this is actually showing us the filtered users. So I'm passing users in. If I go here, I am yielding, though, the result of filtered users, which is set on my component, as people. I could call this anything, but throwing the users around is super confusing. And then for each person, people, maybe each people as person. That probably makes more sense. We then render this stuff. So we're passing in, so because we're in this block element, we can actually control the context of what's going on within our component's yield field. That's, I think, really, really cool. So next we want to go over actually filtering this list. So much like controllers and routes, components have actions. We can specify actions like clicking something. In this case, we want to set an action when the person actually types something. And we want to call this filter list of users. Really descriptive name. So what do we want to do, right? We want the user to enter in the person's first name. And then we want to filter that list to only show people with that first name. So here we can say let first name equals get this first name, right? That's the first step. So we've gotten the first name that the person enters. Next, we want to filter the users list. So let users equals get this users. Then we want to specify the filter. So let narrowed user list equals users dot, we're going to find them by name. So find by is a really great method. We'll search this array. We'll go through every single object. We'll find the name property that matches first name. So then finally we're going to set this filtered users to be our narrowed user list. So here I actually put this, so this is actually going to return an object. So the each loop is only going to work on an array, so I put it into an array. So now I think, well, now we actually have to call this action. Sorry about that. So I have this action call, but now how do I actually make it happen every time somebody types? That's when we can specify a key up action, which is an action called filter list of users. So now if I type in Bob, hey, look at that. There's Bob the plumber. If I type in Lisa, there's Lisa the lawyer. Cool. Problem is, it keeps clearing out my list, right? Because it's not finding matches. So we should write a little logic to say if we don't find any matches, render the whole list. That way we don't get this kind of confusing behavior as soon as somebody starts typing. So here we can just say, if there is a narrowed list, then, whoops, we'll do that. Otherwise, set this filtered list of users, filtered users to be our users array. We refresh, so now if I start typing, because there aren't any matches, we're not re-rendering that list, but as soon as there is one, hey, look at that. It filters it down. Cool. So one of the last things that I want to cover on components is kind of touching on this a little bit more of actions, right? So you'll hear a lot of people say data down, actions up. That's kind of like the principle of Ember. What does that mean? Well, we pass data down to our components, and we can have actions actually bubble up. So let's create an action on our controller. Just call it test action. And we'll make an alert, make it really obnoxious. Hey there, cool. So we can actually pass this action down to our user filter component. We'll say, hey there equals action, test action. So now we have an attribute called hey there. So if I go back here, let's maybe add a button. And this has another action. We'll call this new test. So if I create this new test action here on our component, here's our new test action, I can have this actually call the action on the controller. So let new test action equals get this test action, and then we can call it. Oops, and I have an error. Test action is not a function because I called it hey there. So I create this action called the test action on my controller, which makes it accessible on my template. I then pass that to my component, but here I call it hey there instead of test action. So in the actual component, I can access it just like any other attribute, right? So first I can get it, and then I can call it. You can actually do this too. Oops. So get this hey there, and then just as soon as I have it, call it. I find that confusing though. I find it kind of hard to read. I find this a little more idiomatic. Like, let's get this attribute. Oh, it's a function, let's call it. One of the other things you'll see a lot is it's called this.attrs. So you'll see people will call this.attrs, whoops, hey there. I think that's how you do it. And I mean, this technically works. It works with these closure actions. A closure action being when I say, hey there equals, and then in parentheses action, test action. There's this really good article that Lox wrote. He's a contributor to Ember about when to use attrs and when not to. And basically, this really isn't supported yet. You can do it, it's just really not the right way to do it. And I'll link to this article in the description of this video so you can kind of read over why. It explains it in a lot better detail than I can. But also just know, you know, these are both really kind of the same result. You'll see some people do it this way, some people do it that way. Just know that it's kind of the same thing. We're calling an action which is an attribute that was passed to this component. So finally, one of the last things that you can do though we can say action equals test action, right? Because that's what it was called in our controller. And this isn't the way I would recommend to do this, but you can say this dot send action. Did I spell that right? Action. Let's go back to our app here. So why does this work? Because here I specified a string, and then I used send action. So send action by default looks for a property called action on our component, and it has to be a string in this case, and that string is passed up and matched to something on our controller. So you'll see there, if I have a bunch of gibberish, it doesn't find it, nothing handle the action, blah, 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 blah. This is the old way to do actions. This is kind of how you had to do them before. Now with closure actions, we can specify, hey there equals, in parentheses, it's an action, and then I can call it like any other attribute. Here, we're not really calling an attribute on the component. We're saying, yeah, let the controller or the router, whatever, handle this. We're sending it up. And I believe you don't have to specify action. If this was, monkey, I could say this dot send action called monkey, and that works. So if you call it action by default, this call is the same as this. So by default, it's going to try to pass the string of action. But you could actually specify multiple ones. So again, we want to be doing it this way. This is the way that's going to be supported. The send action thing is going to be deprecated at some point. But just know, when you're going through and reading lots of tutorials or blogs and stuff, you might come across that. It's really the same thing. Just kind of keep that in mind. It's not necessarily wrong right now. You can certainly do it that way. I would recommend, doing it this way. You have a lot more control over what's happening, because again, it's an attribute on our component. We can handle it, versus send action, which is bubbling up to whatever parent level, and we're just saying, let the controller just kind of handle this. Just something to keep in mind. So that's kind of the basics of components in a nutshell. Again, they're really just things that we want to render on our page. They come with JavaScript files and template files. These are kind of like controllers in a way that we can control what data is accessible in our templates, but they're very different from controllers, because I can actually have thousands of the same component, and they're all unique. They all have their own attributes, unlike controllers, which there's only a single instance of them. But they're a really great way to just isolate your code and become familiar with the life cycle. So we went over the basic life cycle that happens every time it's inserted on a page, but we also have re-render, which is like if we were hiding components for whatever reason, or updating attributes. Here is did update attrs. So if that users array, if that got updated somewhere else, if it got updated by something on my controller, this would actually be called. So just know, if you're putting logic in did receive attrs, and for some reason those attrs are getting manipulated somewhere else, you probably want to do the same exact hook in did update attrs. And then finally, you can actually you can actually hook into the destroy lifecycle too. So will destroy element, will clear render, did destroy element. So we can actually specify things that we want to happen once the component is actually destroyed, once it's hidden, once we browse away to a different page. If we hide it in an if block, just kind of know that all that stuff's available to us. So cool. Hopefully you learned something, even if you're really familiar with Ember components, and leave a comment if you have any questions. Thanks.